she really just always encouraged me to just go out and show the world who I am with my trach, not in spite of my trach, but with my trach.
Hello, you're listening to The Rare Life. I'm your host, Madeline Cheney. Today we have Erica Stearns, a disabled mom of disabled children. Erica was gracious enough to chat about her relationship with her mother growing up and how that has evolved as she also found herself as a medical mom. The advice she gives is golden, and I'm kind of obsessed with this episode. But before I fully introduce it, we have a new question of the month. It is, what not to say to a parent of medically complex children. So I'm kind of picturing this coming from unfortunate past experiences, while also acknowledging that we may differ in what makes us cringe. And I'm super excited to see your answers to this. As always, head to the website, therarelifepodcast.com, to answer it and to see last month's answers. Okay, so back to the episode. This conversation is kind of a sequel to episode 50 with Catherine Acton, who shared her perspective as sister to her medically complex brother, Jonathan. If you haven't caught that one yet, be sure to go back and give it a listen. I just love both Catherine's perspective and Erica's. And it's pretty cool because they both center on the same theme, and that is our imperfect love for our children. Erica and I do delve into the touchy subjects of ableism and oversharing, and I hope that you listen with an open heart. I do find myself getting kind of defensive with these topics, but Erica is so gentle in her approach, and the whole episode just emanates love. It really is a celebration of our love for our children and our relationship with our children. And I really hope that you can just bask in the love you feel for your children and kind of be revitalized by that. So a little more about Erica. If you listened to episode 34, which was actually the season 2's finale episode, you already heard her. She shared a recorded takeaway, and it was so meaningful. And I knew I needed a whole episode with her. And she didn't disappoint. Erica also has a podcast for parents like us, and it is called Atypical Truth. So check out the show notes for a link to listen to that. Erica just completed her honors thesis about social media as a form of therapy, which inspired her podcast. She lives in Southern Illinois with her husband, Randy, and her 2 beautiful children, Margot, who is 5, and Carrie, who is 3. She is a lover of sunshine and being productive. Let's jump in. Hi, Erica. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Madeline. Thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm so honored to have you speak to your experiences as both a mom to children with disabilities and as an adult with disabilities, and to speak to your relationship with your mom and, help us glean wisdom from the way that you've experienced life. I would love to start out with kind of setting the scene and comparing and contrasting your medical complexities with Margot's and Carrie's, since, you've told me that they are not really related.
Yeah, so my own experience with disability is drastically different from my children. For myself, I had a lot of machines. I had a lot of hospitalizations. I had many surgeries. My mom, I think, lost count at like 32.
Oh my goodness.
So while I was trach dependent until I was 15, I did have full cognitive functioning. So I had a pretty typical experience of growing up, aside from not being able to maybe speak for a short while and not eating like other kids ate for a while. So really when I was about 3 was when I got to experience a more typical childhood, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
My kids, Margot and Carrie, they don't have trachs, but they do have life-sustaining medical equipment. They have a severe form of epilepsy. It happens
Mm.
to be drug resistant, and especially during infancy, it was just unrelenting. It was a very scary time for our family. But they have kind of a spectrum of other conditions that really stem from their genetic condition, which, caused the epilepsy, it caused brain
Mm.
abnormalities. So they're nonverbal, they're developmentally delayed. So, their experience is very different from my own in the fact that they are cognitively unable to process things and also display what they are able to process in
Mhm.
the same ease and way that I'm able to.
Mm.
So, in a lot of ways, we have a lot of similar experiences, having been hospitalized a lot. But where I could share my needs with more actions and then later on in life with words, they're limited in their ability to do that. So, we definitely have very different experiences.
Mm.
Obviously, my childhood lent to this form of motherhood, becoming a medical mom. It definitely led to me being more natural at it, I think.
Mhm.
Stays in the hospital aren't quite as traumatizing or uncomfortable as they are for most people because I spent so much of my childhood living in a hospital.
Yeah,
So,
that
my
makes
husband, on
sense.
the other hand, you take him into a hospital and he gets clammy and just like physically ill immediately. It's so overwhelming. And for me,
Mm.
I'm just like, hey guys, we're back. How's it going? So,
That's so cute.
yeah, similar, but so, so extremely different too.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll kind of segue into,
Hmm.
your relationship with your mom and especially as a child. I guess just to jump right in, how would you describe your relationship with your mom? And kind of,
Hmm.
what is her background and what were things like for her when you were a kid?
Yeah. So, my relationship with my mother is actually it's a very complicated one. And that's honestly a very difficult thing to admit because it doesn't mirror the the standard mother-daughter relationships that I see
Mhm.
frequently, but it's definitely evolved drastically since I became a mother to children with medical complexities.
Mm.
My mother, she did go through many of the same experiences that I experienced in motherhood, but with one major difference, and that being that she was a single mom. And
Mm.
as with many women, my entire experience of motherhood is obviously intertwined with the experiences that I had with my own mom as I watched her love on me, care for me, get frustrated
Mm.
with me, you know.
Mhm.
And now, as I see it through these mountains and the valleys of life as a medical mom, I have found myself repeatedly referencing to the experience of my mother, either
Mm.
the experience that she openly shared with me, but also the experience of the things she didn't share with me. Because
Mm.
I now know as an adult that there was probably a lot she was going through that she couldn't tell me as
Mhm.
a child, concepts that would have been over my head and maybe quite frankly too sad.
Yeah.
So, I definitely feel that, just as my life is infinitely intertwined with my children. Hers is intertwined with mine, and now also my children. So I definitely hold more compassion for my mother, and that's really strengthened
Mm.
our relationship, which think I would have described previously as being somewhat weak.
Mhm.
Um, she faced a lot of the same things that I faced. As soon as I was born, she was told I had a very scary and life-threatening condition. It was scary and life-threatening for 1985.
Yeah.
It's far less scary and it's more manageable now with the technology we have these days. But my
Mm.
mother had to watch me get rushed away from her arms, become intubated, and like instantly have multiple surgeries. And
Mm.
I came out of that dependent on machines for survival. She was
Mm.
a single mom, and that's a huge factor in this that I'll never be able to relate to. And honestly, I just have so much respect for it because it's unfathomable how one might navigate this alone. I just can't even imagine it. I
Yeah.
think we all have thought, like, how could I do this without my partner?
Yes.
So, yeah, so she quickly had to learn the ropes of caring for a medically fragile child. And that was not experience she had, just like me and you. We didn't have a lot of medical experience before this.
Mhm.
Um, and for her, she was faced with a lot of the same, I would say, grim theories on what I would or would not be able to do. And she had
Mhm.
to prepare her life and mine based on that knowledge because she didn't have a lot of access to the things we are privileged in being able to access these days through the internet and social media.
Mhm.
And she definitely didn't see anyone like me in her local community.
Right.
So she definitely had to do a lot of, shifting of her own life. So she was
Mm.
initially told I would never be able to breathe on my own, which obviously meant, I wouldn't be able to engage in any sort of extraneous activities, that I would
Right.
ever be able to eat or swallow safely, nor
Mm.
would I even be able to have a voice. Um,
Wow. You know, it was a different time and age, but I do think a lot of that stuff is so relatable for so many parents. Just even the grim outlook of, the doctors coming and telling you what your child will never do and that there's no guarantee that they'll live.
Mhm,
And for those who are doing this by themselves, just all of it, there are so many things, so many of the basics that are very relatable.
mhm,
And, I it's interesting because as you're speaking, I'm like, I have developed a lot more compassion for my own parents as I've become a parent too. And even, I didn't have any disabilities. And so it's a different kind of parenting experience. But, there is kind of this moment, I think, for so many when we become parents to be like, oh,
mhm.
like, oh, this is hard. And you can have so much more grace for
Absolutely.
them.
Yeah, I definitely think that applies to your journey as a parent, regardless of
Mm,
a situation where you might have disabilities or a
mm,
perfectly typical childhood. Let's face it, we all experience struggles. We all watched our parents struggle with this
mm.
and really watched them probably come to terms and to grace with their own parents. So
Yeah.
it's very
Yeah.
cyclical, right?
Yes, totally. Well, what kind of advice would you have, like drawing from your childhood and the
Mhm,
things that annoyed you or kind of rubbed you the wrong way? What can we learn from you? What can we try to improve upon in our parenting to help, maybe someday Kimball or one of our other children will be interviewed on a podcast
mhm.
and they'll be talking about all the things that they wish that we hadn't done and the things that we thought were awesome. What would be a way for us to have more of the awesome in there?
More awesome. When I think of awesome, I think of just some very basic things that my mom did that I even see myself doing
Mhm.
occasionally when I can. And that was just like believing in me. And
Mm,
for her, I think one thing she did really well was that she was just very transparent with me.
mm,
Um, so one thing that I could sense pretty early on was that I was different and I lived a different lifestyle than most people
mhm,
because of my trach, because of my need to be sectioned. And, I sensed this because of the way people spoke to me, be in their tone, or really more often
mm,
the way they spoke to my mom. But also
mhm,
there was, in addition to like verbal communication that was different, there was also nonverbal communication that struck me as odd, like
mm,
their staring or their effort in not making contact, or maybe
mm,
even their body language, the way they'd posture in a very put off and guarded manner, or the way they'd kind of grab their kid and pull them away and be like, no, no, she's. So there was a
mhm,
lot of things that spoke to me that I was different. And I don't think it was intentional, but as a kid, you do sense this. My mom, I'll never forget, the way she approached that was just very graceful and honest. I
mm,
remember it being something like, well, honey, you're probably the first person they've ever met who has a trach. How cool is that? And
mm,
they don't know all the things you can do, nor do they know how smart you are yet. So you just have to be
mm.
sure to show them who you are and what you can do.
I love that.
In many ways, this harbored the performance artist in me. So, but
I'll
she
show them.
really, yes. And she really just always encouraged me to just go out and show the world who I am,
Mm.
with my trach, not in spite of my trach, but with my trach. So,
Oh, I love that.
and I have to be honest, I think about the ways that she advocated for me, but it's hard to remember those things because I believe she advocated for me tirelessly, but it likely happened behind the scenes,
Mm,
outside of my scope, on a phone call that was taken in a different room, in a conversation that was behind a wall. I didn't understand it then, but I do have some comprehension of it now.
mm.
Um, I now understand the totality of the effort she made in giving me the awesome life that I have. Um,
Mm. I remember your takeaway for season 2 that you
mhm,
submitted. And I mean, it brought me to tears. It was so meaningful in your perspective of all the love that you felt from your mom
mhm,
and that you noticed things. Like you noticed her sewing the soft trach ties for you so it'd be more comfortable and the way that you were able to just feel that love. And,
mhm.
I think I don't know. I just keep thinking that's kind of what it just always comes back to is the hope that we all have that our children will feel of that love as imperfect as our attempts are at being a
Mhm.
good mom, is that they will feel that love shine through.
I'll never fully understand or really know all that she did to advocate for me because I didn't see
Mm,
that.
mm,
What I saw and what I felt were the in person physical interactions, the loving interactions, the way she would. So, I mean, she didn't just sew my trach ties, she sewed bracelets with bells on them so she could hear me. It was a benefit for
aw.
her, but it was also a way for me to communicate. I'd ring
Mm,
my wrist and she'd hear me and come running in.
mm,
Um, that was the only way she, could hear me or know that I was crying at night.
mm,
So, things like that, but also just the way she adored me. And I think the reason I want to bring this up is because we spend a lot of time on our devices and we spend a lot of time doing things because we want to educate society and the world about our kids. But really, the most important thing is being present with them because
mm,
I didn't see her fight. What I would have seen is her being gone or having her face in the phone. I mean, I do remember her on the phone with her girlfriends for many hours with her cup of decaf coffee, but she needed that,
Yeah, yeah.
just like we need our outlets too.
Uh-huh.
But the most important thing is to be present, to show that physical love. And I think that is why I try to be mindful of my own ways of showing up for my kids. If I'm holding
Mm,
them, I put things down. I don't have a screen in their face because this is all I've got. They don't
mhm,
understand if I am like, you know, on a blog post going, "Oh, this is ableism," and just really
mhm.
trying to advocate or educate someone. My kids will never know that. What they know is that I'm
Right.
sitting with them. I'm rubbing
Mm,
their arms, I'm kissing their cheeks. That's what they know. That's the love I
mm.
wanna show them. So,
I love that.
so to answer your question, some things that she didn't do as well, I think that if you had asked me this question before I was a mother, I would have answered it in a very different way and with maybe a harsher tone, to be honest.
Yeah.
However, knowing my mom and now knowing myself as a medical mom, I see things differently. So, one thing that very, very much complicated our relationship was kind of her need to tell everyone about my medical issues.
Mm,
I absolutely hated it. It would happen frequently. I mean, we could be at a restaurant and she would tell a stranger, someone we would never see again, about my medical condition. And I just did
mhm.
not understand that. I think as a child and, into my teenage years, I saw it as her being hungry for the attention or the sympathy that I garnered.
Mm.
And honestly, my physical reaction to that is that I would just shrink and I would become totally unengaged. And probably even I would begin behaving obnoxiously because I just did not want the attention
Mm.
regarding my medical condition.
Yeah.
I now am able to see that this was a defense mechanism my mother had built into her arsenal of advocating for me. She probably caught the stare from the stranger, the look, an awkwardness that someone displayed when they walk up to us.
Mhm.
And it was her way of quickly defending me by educating others about my condition. I
Mm.
see that now. I see that that is an instinct that many of us parents can relate to,
Yeah.
including myself, you know?
Yeah.
And I think she continued to utilize that tool long after I was sick, long after my trach was removed, long after I was no longer visibly disabled. And that maybe is where it was more hurtful or harmful because
Mm.
I was working on myself and trying to separate myself from my disability, which was also harmful and likely
Mhm.
a result of our society and,
Mhm.
the problematic ways in which it views disabled people.
Yes.
So, because of this experience, I try to be extremely mindful and careful regarding the tools that I use when advocating for and also educating others about my children. I
Mhm.
try to ask myself, is this benefiting my children or society? And if so, how? And what is the
Mm.
cost? If the answer is
Mhm.
that it will actually benefit me personally, like when I need to vent or when I need to feel supported because I'm going through something hard, then I'm very careful and conscientious about how I word things to try to make a point to say, this is about me. I'm the one in need of the love and the show of
Mhm.
support. My
Yeah.
kids may never grow up to read the things that I post online, but I still feel like that's my responsibility knowing what I know.
And I think that is a really huge differentiation to make. A lot of
Mhm.
times when we're, seeking support from other parents or sharing our story to help others feel less alone is like, it really isn't about our kids. And that sounds kind of selfish or like self centered, but I feel like that's when we can kind of take the license to share things. If it's like, I mean, I know you'll probably get into this too, where it's so intertwined with each other too, with
Mhm.
us, with our children, but we can speak to what it's like to be a parent, and they'll be able to speak maybe someday about what it's like to be a disabled person. And those are kind of two separate things.
Mhm.
I don't know, kind of messily intertwined the two at the same time.
Mhm. They are. And I still struggle with determining where that fine line is drawn between
Yeah.
being an advocate for my kids versus my constant fear of exploiting my disabled children, right? Like
Right.
many people, and you know this,
Mm.
have opinions regarding, well, anything you do as a parent, really, if we're going to be honest.
Yes.
I think because harm has been done in the past, especially with vulnerable children such as our children, people have a tendency to kind of monitor parents of kids with medical issues and disabilities, maybe more harshly than parents of typically developing kids.
Mm.
And I've been on sides of that. I've been the child being overly shared about. I've been the mom who overshared about my own children. And
Mm.
I've also been the person who formed opinions about how someone else overshared. So
Right.
I've admittedly been on all sides. I don't feel great about it. Um, and so much of this does stem from me having been a mother who had a tendency to overshare about my differences.
Mm.
But I knew it came from a place of love. And that's the part that I keep personally going back to, is that it comes from a place of love. My
Mhm.
mother's story is also my story. Her journey is a part of my journey. It's impossible to separate them. And honestly, I feel like it would be unfair to say, Mom, don't talk about all my hospitalizations, because they were her hospitalizations too.
Right.
She experienced trauma from it as well. She was right there with me, just as I'm right there with my children now.
Mm.
And in so many ways, her story, my story, it's intertwined forever. My story is her story. But if I'm being honest, this is something I just could never have realized without having gone through it myself.
Mhm.
I was definitely more critical and hard on her about sharing my story before I became a parent whose journey was just drastically altered because of my kids' conditions and my need to ensure their survival, and how that changed me as a person, just as it
Mm.
did her.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a tough spot to be in because it's not a guarantee that any of our children will have children themselves, but those of them who do, what are the chances of them also having a child with disabilities and having that same lens that you have? And so, I think there is kind of that worry of like, Kimball won't totally get where I'm coming from in a lot of the
Yeah.
things that I've done as his mom. And, you know, you hope that the love shines through and that that's kind of the redeeming factor, but it does kind of bother me
Mhm.
that he may judge me based on our separate experiences, I guess, our different
Mhm.
perspectives.
Well, and you have Wendy, who is watching you do this, and she might have a
Hmm.
disabled child, or she might have a
Yeah.
child who has a disabled child.
Hmm.
And her journey with this is going to obviously be influenced by your journey with it. Her journey is also intertwined with Kimball's, and
Hmm.
he is a part of her story.
Yeah.
So you're kind of setting the stage for how she also shares about him.
Mhm.
And if you think about it that way, then I feel like you can't go wrong because you're always going to start with love and end with love. And there's going to be hard parts in between. Wendy sees the hard parts surely more
Mhm.
than anyone else because you're her mother and she can intuitively sense when mom's having a hard time. Just
Yes.
like when you can intuitively sense when Kimball's getting sick or when Wendy's getting frustrated, you know?
Mhm. Totally.
So, yeah, it's definitely it feels like a giant weight of responsibility, but isn't that just parenthood in a nutshell? Like we have
Yes.
these we don't really stress about some aspects of parenthood. Like there's a part of me that just can't even imagine what it's like to think about having raised a child and then putting them in a vehicle and saying, "Okay, you can drive 70 miles per hour down the highway." That terrifies me.
Yeah.
So it's a different kind of responsibility.
Totally. And I've thought of that too recently and kind of like I don't know, when you're kind of reading different things about ableism and specifically ableism in parents, that does strike a
Mhm.
sensitive chord. But one way that I've kind of, I don't know, come to terms with it or had more peace is realizing that my children will absolutely have things to talk about when someone asks, "What did your parents do that drove you crazy or you wish they didn't do?" Like, they always will. Take away his disability, he would still have lots to say. And so
Yes.
that is kind of reassuring. It's kind of depressing. I wish there
Right.
was some way to be a perfect parent, but at the same time, it's reassuring because we do best with what we know and we should continually educate ourselves
Mhm.
and try to do better. But at the end of the day, they will have things to say that bothered them. I think, seeing it through that way too helps
It does. I
dispel the
love
fear.
that. I love that perspective. And to take it one step further, I'll be very transparent myself and say, I have disabilities and I still get it wrong. I've
Mm.
lived with this, internalized ableism my whole life. I've I don't think I'm ever going to get it right. And I comfort myself with the fact that I have non-disabled friends who don't feel like they're doing life right either.
Mhm.
So I think the effort, we're all putting in the effort, and that's really what matters, right? We're leading with love and we're
Mm.
trying our darndest to do this right.
Yes. I guess we can just end with what greatest lesson did you take away from your mom that you've brought into your parenting?
Mm. You know, I had a front row seat to unfortunately watching my mother's mental health deteriorate as a result of a lot of stress and PTSD that comes with being a single
Mm.
mom raising a kid with medical complexities,
Mm.
and also losing the one support person that she had when I was really very young. So it took a significant toll on her mental health. And
Mm.
I observed that. I noticed that. And it progressively got worse as I got older. So certain things became more
Mm.
noticeable. It did not help that during this time, there was a dark stigma and honestly a lack of access involving the pursuit of mental health support during this time.
Mm.
And I think also her religious upbringing may have fostered the act of avoiding addressing mental health. Instead, she was taught to kind of bottle it up.
Mm.
And we all know now that this is just not possible
Yeah.
without consequences, without grave
Yeah.
consequences. Soon the pressure of these emotions, they take a systemic toll on our bodies. And they can eventually result in pretty harmful effects. So, my mother, she struggled with what was first depression and PTSD. it evolved into manic spells and really full-blown meltdowns and emotional outbursts.
Mm.
And eventually all these undiagnosed and untreated issues, it eventually like triggered an autoimmune disorder in her body, which then resulted in many debilitating medical issues. So
Wow.
now I live 2 states away, but I do a lot of caretaking of her and going with her virtually to doctor's appointments. So the roles have kind of reversed. And
Interesting.
in looking at that, I see how harmful the stress of this life can be, not only to our minds, but to our bodies. And that has helped me to be more proactive when it comes to my own mental health. And I think
Mm.
that is probably the one thing I stress the most about amongst my friends is how important it is for us as parents or caregivers of, especially for caregivers of medically complex kids, to make our mental health a priority.
Mm.
And it's challenging. It's challenging to find the time, the means, the ability to make this happen, but it truly is one of the most enriching things that we can do for ourselves, which then directly benefits our children.
Mhm.
When we think about not knowing the future, not knowing how long we have, we think about how we might be limited in our ability to care for our children as they grow. That's
Yeah.
only further compounded if we're not taking care of ourselves. And I am a firm believer that the best form of self-care starts with being proactive about your mental health, addressing it,
Mm.
and by whatever means, therapy, medicine, yoga, listening to podcasts. If you get a therapeutic value from an activity,
Mm.
engage in that activity more often.
Oh,
Make it a
yeah.
point, chisel time out in your day. I've heard you say you like your baths. That's a very therapeutic thing for you, and I love that you've
Mhm.
made a point to have that time for yourself.
Mm.
Do you feel like that has helped you? I know you're in therapy currently, you've talked
Mhm.
about that.
Yeah, and as you were listing the different therapeutic things, I really like that because my mind just went straight to like traditional therapy. And there are several therapeutic things that we can do and that are individualized to us and what makes us feel better and kind of work through those emotions. So, my bubble baths, like that kind of thing, I think it helps me stay mentally where I need to be. That
Mhm,
being said, I would be in a really dark place still if I hadn't attended traditional therapy,
mhm.
about a year and a half ago. And so I do feel like all those things have their places and their
Mhm.
times.
I agree. Some are more accessible than
Mhm.
others, especially I
Mhm.
mean, I think about it, my oldest is 5 years old, and I just because of COVID and telehealth becoming a more accessible means of,
Mm.
everyone pivoted to telehealth because of COVID, and
Yeah.
because of that, for the first time in my experience of being a medical mom, I was able to attend therapy.
Mm.
I couldn't leave my house before. I certainly couldn't carve out that kinda time,
Yeah.
and even with that said, it's a struggle because from 1 week to the next, I can't tell you if I'm gonna be able to make that phone call or even if
Mm.
I'm gonna have to jump off that phone call to suction my kid, so
Yeah.
traditional therapy is not accessible to everyone, which is really what a lot of my research is about, is how there are so many different platforms and activities that hold therapeutic value. How do we, as a society and also as a mental health profession, combine them
Mm.
and educate people on how to tap into those experiences more?
Mm. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening and sharing your really valuable insights.
Yeah, you're welcome. I just appreciate you asking me, and I hope that this provides some insight or really just helps to remind parents that their child may not end up being a parented disabled person, but I think regardless, they will be able to look back and really recognize the love, however flawed or imperfect it might be. If you led with love, I don't think you can go wrong. So
check out the website to answer this month's question and for adorable photos of Erica and crew. You can also find information on how to find Erica on social media and how to listen to her podcast, A Typical Truth, in the show notes. We all need more Erica in our lives. I will also say reading and listening to disabled adult voices is so important. Erica is one such voice, and like all humans, opinions and perspectives vary a lot. So I've found it super interesting to follow disabled adults on Instagram and read what they have to say about like ableism and things that we've discussed in the episode. In the show notes, I actually have a little list of some of my favorite accounts to follow to kind of get you started if you want to do that. So check those out. Also, if you feel a need for more accessible therapy, check out our sponsor, BetterHelp. They are an online counseling service at a more affordable price than traditional in-person therapy. You fill out a questionnaire and they match you with a licensed therapist according to your preferences. And then you can either do video chats, phone calls, texting, messaging, whatever works with your lifestyle. So it's kind of made for people like us. And if you sign up with the link in the show notes, you get a discount for your first month, and a portion of it goes directly towards the podcast, which is awesome. It's a win-win. So go check it out. Join us next week for Season 3's finale episode. We get to celebrate another amazing season full of amazing episodes, and you get a glimpse at Season 4's theme. Don't miss it. See you then.